Hi everyone, welcome back. So in the last set of videos we talked about using phase portraits to analyze a nonlinear 2D autonomous system. One of the things that was in that particular example is we had a periodic solution, but we mentioned that we didn't quite have the techniques to prove that there was a periodic solution and that something else weird didn't happen. In this lecture we're actually going to cover some of the theory behind the Poincare Bendixson theorem, which allows you to prove the and its variants of it, which allow you to prove either the existence or non-existence of a periodic solution within a particular part of the phase plane. So first, let's go ahead and recall what we mean by periodic solutions. So a 2D linear autonomous system x dot is equal to ax. These are all of let me go ahead and be explicit about that. X dot of t is equal to ax of t, where A is a 2x2 real matrix. A is a 2x2 real matrix, and the eigenvalues of A are purely imaginary. Has a center at 0 and periodic solutions around it. And this is because it's basically the sum of sines and cosines. For example, in this case here, where we have A is equal to 0, 1, minus 1, 0, we know that the eigenvalues, lambda 1, 2, are equal to plus or minus I. And I'm not going to go through and explicitly solve it here, but you can solve this implicitly using separation by variables, or you can solve it explicitly by making use of the techniques, the eigenvalue eigenvector techniques we had. You just have to deal with some imaginary numbers. And what you have is you have a center, an equilibrium here at 0, and a center, and the trajectories follow clockwise circles around the origin. Now, the question though is, so we know that the linear systems have periodic solutions. The major question here is, when does a nonlinear system have a periodic solution? And in order to properly understand that, we need to think about limiting trajectories, so limiting orbits. So we need to add a little bit of notation to understand this. So let's add a little bit of notation. Let me go ahead and write down that question. So when does a nonlinear system have periodic solutions? And this is a much more complicated problem. But let's start with some notation about limiting orbits. So consider a 2D autonomous system. And we're going to be working with this 2D autonomous system in the general form for this entire lecture, where we have dx dt is equal to some function f of x and y, and dy dt is equal to some function g of x and y. So we're turning it from this matrix form into this, we're separating out the two variables in the matrix just to make our life a little bit easier notationally. And we know that dx dt, and we know that these are continuous functions. So we have this 2D autonomous system, and we have these continuous, and we also need that, we need continuous partial derivatives, where f and g have continuous partial derivatives. In some disk that we care about, in some region of the plane. What exactly that region was will depend a little bit on which theorem we're using, but I'm just going to leave it at that. So given that, the solution trajectory and I'm going to call this capital gamma of x naught t, is a solution to the system. Where x naught is equal to x naught y naught, little x naught y naught, which is equal to x at the time t naught, y at time t naught. And furthermore, what we have is that I'm going to use different colors for this. Lambda plus of x naught t naught is the positive orbit. The part of gamma x naught t where t is greater than or equal to t naught, and we have a negative orbit, gamma minus of x naught t naught, negative orbit. So this is the part where part of gamma of x naught t, sorry, I think I meant, oh sorry, these are not t naughts, these are functions of t, so I have a notational error there. Yeah, so the parts of them where t is less than or equal to t naught. So what does this look like? So if you draw out some solution trajectories, well, you have some starting point, let's call this x naught, and the positive orbit is just where this thing goes as time goes to infinity. So this is the positive orbit. And you have some negative orbit, which is basically going backwards in time. So the arrow still points forwards because this is the negative orbit. And the positive orbit, where things are going forward in time. Okay, now, these might just go on to infinity, of course, but one of the important things is if solutions are bounded, either in the positive or negative direction, then they approach some limiting set, limiting sets as t goes to negative infinity or t goes to positive infinity. So they may not approach, oh sorry, I'm covering that up. So they may not approach a single limit, but if you've trapped a trajectory that goes on towards infinity in some box, then at some point it has to bounce between some number of points. And we're going to define these limiting sets. So the what we're going to call the alpha limit set, set alpha of x naught, is the set of points approached by gamma minus, let me go and put this in the right color, gamma minus as t goes to negative infinity. And more precisely, if we assume that XO and YO, so a point is in the alpha limit set, alpha of x naught, if and only if there exists a decreasing sequence of times t I from I equal 1 to infinity, where ti approaches minus infinity, such that the limit as I goes to infinity of x of ti, y of ti is equal to xl, yl. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that as time goes to negative infinity, as you go backwards along this trajectory, you're trapped within some box. And so that trajectory is going to go bounce back and forth in this box somewhere. So this is the entire set of points that it bounces back and forth between. It might be a single point, it might be an entire range of points, but there has to be some set of points that this bounces between. And that it hits many, many times because you're stuck there for time infinity. And there's a comparable, what we call the omega limit for as time goes to positive infinity. Let me just copy this since the definition is quite similar. And let me just change a couple things. So that was the alpha limit, alpha because it's the start of the alphabet, and this is at time negative infinity, so at the very, very beginning of time. And we have the omega limit. Limit set omega of x naught is the set of points approached by omega plus as time goes to positive infinity, which is the set of points these are the set of points in the plane such if and only if there exists an increasing sequence of times where the times are going to positive infinity such that the limits still hold. So basically, you have these two different directions that you're going, and one direction goes in the positive direction and the other goes in the negative direction. So if we draw this out, assume that we again had our point x naught. Maybe in the negative direction it goes to an equilibrium, so it approaches an equilibrium point. And maybe in the positive direction, maybe it actually, instead of approaching an equilibrium, approaches a periodic solution. So things like that. And so sometimes the limits are single points, sometimes they're entire sets of points, sometimes those sets of points include a periodic solution, sometimes those sets of points include equilibria. The topic of today's lecture is classifying all these different possibilities. So how do we classify and understand what these limiting sets look like? And the answer to that is the Poincare Bendixson theorem and related results. So this is Theorem 5.6 in the Linda Allen's textbook. So this is Poincare Bendixson. So we're going to let gamma plus of x naught t be a positive orbit. So as time moves forward towards infinity, that remains in a closed and bounded, so a compact region of the plane. And we're going to suppose that the omega limiting set, so the limiting set as time goes to positive infinity, does not contain any equilibrium, any equilibria. Then the omega limiting set of x naught is a periodic orbit. Just as an aside, sometimes the trajectory is periodic, so sometimes it's equal to omega of x naught, in which case, obviously, the trajectory itself is a periodic orbit. But even if it doesn't start out as a periodic orbit, it limits towards one. We're not going to prove this. This turns out to be rather tricky to prove, and it requires tools from the topology. You can sort of see some of the hints that it requires topology in our definition here, since we're talking about it remaining in a compact set. But this is going to be super useful in understanding the behavior of systems. So using this theorem, we can actually classify behavior. So this is Theorem 5.7, and this is called Poincare Bendixson trichotomy. So we're going to have the same setup. So we're going to let us have a positive orbit. X naught t be a positive orbit that remains in a closed and bounded set region, and let's give that region a name, B of the plane. And suppose B contains a finite number of equilibria. Len Euler, we have case 1. The limiting set, the omega limit set, omega of x naught, is an equilibrium. So this is the most basic case. So in this case, you have an equilibrium. So let's put that in blue here. So maybe you go directly towards that equilibrium as time goes to infinity, or maybe you spiral inward. That's also that's also allowed. So that's the most basic case. The other case is omega of x naught is a periodic solution. And this will happen this will happen in certain cases where you have a solution that it may not necessarily be a circle, but you go around in some periodic solution, and this is what it limits to. So in this case, you may have some trajectory starting here that sort of spirals outward until it approaches. Oh, sorry, I put that spiral in the wrong direction. You may have some point here which spirals outward until it approaches this limiting set. One important thing to note is that in this particular case, so as an aside, periodic orbits must always enclose at least one equilibrium. And now you might be asking, this seems a little bit weird, because then we just say that if you're a positive orbit that's in a closed and bounded region of the plane that doesn't contain any equilibria linear periodic orbit. This turns out not to be a problem, because what you do here is you create your bounded set to be boxes that so the space between these two green boxes. And you have to be a little bit careful about that, because that means that when you're actually applying Poincare Bendixson, you have to excise the equilibria that's contained within it. So closed and bounded doesn't necessarily mean simply connected. And we'll be getting into that in the next couple of criteria. So just something to keep in mind. So if you have a periodic, let me actually draw that a little again. So you have this periodic orbit here, and you have some equilibrium. What you have to do is you excise these two, and then in this region between them. So this is a closed and bounded region. And so if you have some positive orbit that remains in that region, then there has to be a periodic orbit, because there is no equilibrium for it to go to. Okay, and let's consider the third set of possibilities, which is that omega of x naught contains a finite number of equilibria and a set, a gamma sub I of trajectories, so a bunch of different trajectories, whose alpha and omega sets. So these are the alpha and omega limit sets of these I trajectories. Consist of one of these equilibria. For each gamma I. So this is a little, let me actually separate these out a little bit. So this one's a little bit more complicated, but the basic idea here is that you might have some equilibrium here, and maybe there's a trajectory going from one equilibrium to the other, and so on. So this is not actually a periodic solution because once you get to one of these equilibria, you stop there. But all of these trajectories limit to something along some other trajectory. For example, this one here. So this might limit to something like this, which is not actually a periodic solution because of timing issues, basically. So the phase doesn't quite work out. But these are still, oh, sorry, I don't know why that jumped to the top. So these are still potential omega sets. The other thing that can happen is you can have a single equilibrium, and you could like go out and come back to it as your limiting set. And so then your trajectory doesn't actually go to something periodic because the limiting set like goes back to the equilibrium at time infinity, but the limit set of some trajectory that doesn't start at that point may not end up at the equilibrium in particular. And so those are the different possible cases. So these are the different possible cases, and then one question is, which of these cases applies in any particular example? And so one of the things you can do is you can use like the Poincare Bendixson theorem to show that there is a periodic orbit if you can show that you have a closed and bounded region that doesn't have any equilibrium. At the same time, sometimes it's useful to be able to say that there is no periodic solution, and this is the subject of our next two theorems. So Theorem 5.8, which is also called Bendixson's criteria. So we're going to suppose that we have some set D contained in R squared is open. So note that earlier for the Poincare Bendixson theorem, we talked about a closed and bounded set. Here we have an open and strictly connected set. Not strictly connected, simply connected. And simply connected set. And by simply connected, so this is a technical term from topology. This just means intuitively that there are no holes in the set. So this is open and simply connected. Then we have a divergence rule. So it's a divergence of f and g, which happens to be equal to, for this two-dimensional case, the partial derivative of df dx plus dg dy is not identically 0 and does not change sign in D, then there are no periodic orbits. And there are no periodic orbits of our usual system dx dt is equal to f of x, y, and dx dy dt. dy, sorry, I keep on blocking myself in this particular video. dy dt is equal to g of x, y in D. Okay, and there's a sometimes useful generalization of this, Theorem 5.9, which is Dulac's criterion. Sometimes this is more powerful, though sometimes it's a little bit harder to use, which is just that you can, if you have the same setup, let me actually just copy that setup. So, and no, let me rewrite it because there are some slight differences. So suppose again we have D contained in a region in R squared, which is open and simply connected. And note that it also doesn't have to be bounded, so it's open and simply connected and could possibly be unbounded. And we have b of xy. Some function has continuous partial derivatives in D, and this will be known as a Dulac function. So if this is continuous partial, then we can actually apply the same divergence rule. So divergence rule, which is div of bf bg, so multiplying them together, which is equal to the partial derivative of bf with respect to x, plus the partial derivative of bg with respect to y. If that's not identically zero, and does not change sign, in D, then there are no periodic orbits. Orbits of the system x dot is equal to f of xy, y dot is equal to g of xy. So the same as in the previous example. I'm just using slightly different notation in D. And note, if we let b of xy be equal to 1, then Dulac's criterion is Bendixson's criterion. So this is a generalization where you have some other function that you're multiplying by Bendixson's criteria. Now, this is sometimes a little bit harder to apply, there is no general technique for finding a Dulac function. So you should think about one thing that's similar is you should compare this to integrating factors. Recall that in most cases there isn't a standard way of finding integrating factors, but in certain special cases you can find them, and when you can find them, it makes life a lot easier. So now, in the next half of this lecture, we're going to try to apply this. So we've talked about a lot of theory, but it's a little bit hard to understand what I'm going on about without seeing a couple examples, and that will be the subject. Yeah, so we're going to give a couple examples of this, and hopefully that'll illustrate a little bit more of what we mean. So let's start by, this is going to be example. Unfortunately, Linda's Allen's textbook doesn't actually have very many examples of actually applying these techniques. So I'm actually going to pull an example from Stephen Strogatz's book. So this is from Strogatz, Nonlinear Dynamics and Chaos, second edition. Okay, and I know some of y'all have asked if there are more examples of some of these things, since the textbook we're using, Linda Allen's An Introduction to Mathematical Biology, doesn't actually include that many necessarily mathematical examples, since it's more focused on applying these theorems to biological systems. If you want a more general introduction, Strogatz's Nonlinear Dynamics and Chaos has a ton of examples and is also a really good read. So I'm just plugging the optional reading again. So we're going to get an example that is also biologically related. So cells use something called glycolysis to obtain energy by breaking down sugar. So those of you who have a bit more of a biology background will recall the glycolysis cycle. and all the various intermediates. So it's some cycle of chemical reactions that you use to extract energy from sugar in a usable form for the cell. Now, we're not going to go into the list in detail because it's, well, the topic of a upper-level biochemistry class, but instead, we're just going to talk about a simple model of two of the intermediates. So two of the intermediates are ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, and F6P, which is fructose 6-phosphate. So these two intermediates vary in concentration and vary in number as your cell goes through glycolysis. And a simplified model of the interaction between these two we can write this as a system of two nonlinear ODEs. We have x dot is equal to minus x plus ay plus x squared y, and y dot is equal to b minus ay minus x squared y, where a and b are greater than 0. So now we need to take a moment and use all the techniques that we have been studying for the last couple videos and use x and y noclines to understand the behavior of the phase plane. So we start with the x nocline. So this is just the set where the x dot is equal to 0. So x dot is equal to 0, which is equal to minus x plus ay plus x squared y, which implies that the x nocline is y is equal to x over a plus x squared. And you can show this is just simple algebra. And we have a y nocline. Well, this one y dot is equal to 0, which is equal to b minus ay minus x squared y. And this implies that y is equal to b over a plus x squared. Okay, let's draw this out. So actually, let me switch into the other grid style, since that'll make drawing this out a little bit nicer. So we are only interested in the positive plane, positive quarter plane, positive quadrant, because we are, of course, working with real positive numbers here. So we have x and we have y. And so it turns out that, let's say this is b over a. It turns out that these x and y noclines, when you graph them out, they look something like this. And this is the x, that was the y nocline. Let's give you the x nocline as well. Actually, let me give this a little bit more space. So this will depend, of course, on the exact value of the constants, but we're just going to draw this out in general. Okay, so we have our x nocline and our y nocline, x over a plus x squared, and y is equal to b over a plus x squared. And one of the things that we learned last time is that the equilibrium points are the intersections. So together, these imply that we only have one equilibrium. So the equilibrium is at x bar is equal to b, and y bar is equal to b over a plus b squared. So that's that point there. And one of the important things about noclines is they divide up the plane into regions with positive and negative x dot and y dot. So recall that we can look along the nocline, the sign of the direction of the arrows varies continuously and possibly switches at the equilibria. And so with a little bit of work, you can show that along the x nocline, above the equilibrium, you're going to the right. Along the y nocline. Above the equilibrium, you're going to the right, and below the equilibrium, you're going to your left. And similarly, for the x nocline, to the left of the equilibrium, you're going up. And to the right, you're going down. Now, one of the things about these noclines is that, let me put this in as a note. Since we assume that there are continuous partial derivatives for the x dot and y dot with respect to x and y, what you know is that the noclines divide up the phase plane into regions with positive or negative x dot or y dot. So the noclines divide up the plane into regions with positive or negative x dot and y dot. Because it can't switch from positive to negative except precisely when you cross one of these noclines. So if you were to switch x dot from positive to negative, well, then you have to cross the x nocline. And if you want to switch y from positive to negative, you have to cross the y nocline. So together, this means that into regions with positive, in this region here, where you're between these two noclines, all your trajectories are pointed up and to the right. Because in this region, all your trajectories are pointed down and to the right. In this region, between these two noclines, you're pointed down and to the left. And this region, you're pointed up and to the left. And note that this is true even, this crosses the axes. So this is not something that's bounded by the axes unless the axes themselves are also noclines. And so now what we can do is we can draw out a bounding box around this. So what we want to do in order to apply Poincare Bendixson is we want to bound some set of trajectories to within a box. So let's draw this particular box in green here. Let's see. Let's draw this box. And we want to show that everything in this that starts in this box stays in this box. So how do we show that? Well, the easiest part is because we've already divided this up into regions, we know that we can directly apply, we know that everything along this line, because it's in this region, goes up and to the left. Everything that's on this line goes down and to the right. Everything on this line, well, this is already covering it, goes down to the left, and everything on this line goes up and to the left. So we already know that it won't leave the box in those different regions, and we need to double check that it won't leave it in this diagonal line. And to do that, we note that x dot plus y dot is equal to minus x plus ay plus x squared y plus b minus ay minus x squared y, which is equal to b minus x. So we actually choose this box very carefully. So we choose this particular point to be b over a, there. And we chose that point because if x is greater than b, then x dot plus y dot is less than 0, and x dot is less than minus y dot. What this means is that even if you're going in the positive direction, so long as you're past this, so long as x is greater than b, so that as long as you're past this area, the direction you're moving in the x direction can't be greater than minus y. So what this means is that this actually goes slightly down. So that has to go slightly down because it has to be less than the x is equal to minus y line. And so what this ensures is that by combining all these facts together, actually let me put that in a different color. Oh, I erased that. Let me unerase that. Let me put that in a different color. So let's put that in orange. So along this line, you can ensure that those things are pointed slightly below the bounding box. And so everything does still remain in this box. And so therefore, thus, all solutions starting in the green box are trapped within the green box. So now there's the additional question of when you can excise out a box around the equilibrium and have a closed and bounded set in which the trajectories are trapped. And I'll go ahead and give one setting in which that is the case. So suppose, so this will not always be the case, but suppose that the equilibrium is an unstable node, or spiral. Node or spiral. Then we can cut out a little circle, a little open disk around it, and solutions are still bounded. So what does that look like? Let me copy this down. So let's copy this down. Oh, no. So let's copy that down. Let me erase some of this other stuff around it. So if you copy that down, and what we're going to do here is we're going to create a little ball. I'm making it much bigger than it actually needs to be, just so that it's visible. And one of the things you'll notice is that if it's an unstable node or spiral, then we know that everything goes outward from this node. Actually, let me change that slightly. Everything goes outward, but of course everything still has to go outward respecting the node lines. So things are still going to go outward down in this sort of direction. Things are still going to go outward and down in this sort of direction. Oh, sorry. This is down here, so in like this sort of direction and so on. And what you'll notice is that what this means is that around the circle, because things are going outward, you end up with things still being pushed outward, and because things are constantly being pushed outward, assuming your circle is close enough to your unstable node or spiral, solutions are still bounded. Then there must be a periodic solution in the green box minus the orange circle. Basically what we're doing is we need a closed and bounded set that doesn't contain any equilibria in which the solutions are still trapped. And so what we do is we excise the equilibrium, and so long as the excised equilibrium still causes solutions to be trapped within your within the new region, then you can say that there's a periodic solution. So it's important to note that this does not work if you have an unstable solution or if you have a saddle point. So let me write that down. Note this excision only works if the equilibrium is an unstable node or spiral. Does not work if it is stable or a saddle point. Now, the reason for this is because if it's stable or a saddle point, there's some direction along which trajectories are going inward. And so because of that, you can't ensure that the trajectories don't accidentally cross into your orange circle, even if you make your orange circle really, really small. This works because if the equilibrium is an unstable Nodar spiral, then if you make the circle really, really small, then because of the instability of the equilibrium, trajectories that are along that border get pushed outward. Okay, so now let's take another look at an example where we are dealing with, in this particular case, we were dealing with trying to apply Poincare Bendixson to prove that there was a periodic solution trapped within some region. The other two theorems we talked about, so Bendixson's criteria and Dulac's criteria, deal more specifically with proving that there is no periodic orbit within some region. So let's apply that. That's a little bit easier to apply. So it's in many ways a little bit easier to prove that a periodic solution doesn't exist than that one does exist. And for this, we're going to go back to Linda Zallen's textbook, and we're going to do example 5.17 from the textbook. So let's consider the following. Predator-prey model, where both logistically grow in the absence of the other species. Absence of the other. Okay, and of course we're going to write this as a system of differential equations. dx dt is equal to x times 1 minus ax minus by, and dy dt is equal to y times 1 plus cx minus dy, where a, b, c, and d are positive constants. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to use Dulac's criterion, and we're going to define a Dulac function. So let b of xy be equal to 1 over xy, which is continuously differentiable in the positive quadrant. So the disk D, where D is equal to all points xy, such that x is greater than 0 and y is greater than 0. Okay, so now we need to compute the divergence of bf. Well, I guess we don't have f defined here, but b times x times 1 minus xy minus by, and by 1 plus cx minus dy, which is equal to the divergence once we expand out all the variables, 1 over y, 1 minus ax minus by, and 1 over x, 1 plus cx minus dy. And when we simplify a little bit more, you get this is the divergence of 1, let's just multiply everything out. You get 1 over y minus a times x over y minus b, and 1 over x plus c minus d times y over x. And the divergence by definition is the partial derivative of the first quantity, 1 over y minus a times x over y minus b dx, plus the partial derivative of the second quantity, 1 over x plus c times d times y over x dy, which is just equal to minus a over y minus d over x. And because our constants are positive and we're working in the positive quadrant, this is less than 0 in D. Strictly less than 0. So it's not identically 0 and it never changes sign. Therefore, by Dulac's criterion, there cannot exist any periodic solutions in D. Okay, so let's just go back and review what we talked about in today's video. So we talked about the existence of periodic solutions, and one of the ways we did this is by looking at the limiting set of solution trajectories. So every solution trajectory that is bounded within some region limits to some set of points, and that's as time goes to positive infinity or negative infinity. And these are the positive orbits and the negative orbits. These are limiting sets of the positive and negative orbits, and they're called the alpha limit set for the negative orbit as time goes to the negative infinity. So at the beginning of time, what's the limit? And at the end of time, the omega limit, what is the limit? And by Poincare Bendixson, we didn't prove any of these theorems. But what you can do is it turns out that if you're in a closed and bounded region of the plane, it doesn't have to be something connected, so there can be holes in it, which is important. If you're in a closed and bounded region of the plane, and you don't have any equilibria in that region, then the positive orbit limits to the omega limit set, which is a periodic orbit. And as a general classification, if you have an if you're in a closed and bounded region with a finite number of equilibria, then the omega limit set has to either be an equilibrium, a periodic solution, or some finite number of equilibria with trajectories connecting them. We also gave two different criteria for showing that there are no periodic orbits, and here we worked with open and simply connected sets. So these are open sets that don't have any holes. And it turns out that if you just look at the divergence of the system, basically, possibly multiplied by a Dulac function, then if that is not identically zero and does not change sign in this open set, then there are no periodic orbits. And so you can apply both of these. Directly applying the Poincare Bendixson theorem is a little bit difficult because you have to show that things are bounded within some region, and then you also generally have to excise out holes corresponding to each of the equilibria, and that may or may not work depending on whether or not the equilibrium is stable or unstable. And also there's the trick of figuring out what regions to try to bound things in, since you do need a closed and bounded region. So that's a little bit hard to apply, but we did that in one example. And then we also applied Dulac's criterion in another example, which was a little bit easier, since all you had to do was compute the divergence for some open set, which could possibly be infinite. So that's all for today's video. Hopefully this gives you a little bit better intuition for when you can find periodic solutions of nonlinear 2D autonomous systems.